Well, today's gospel has some rather disturbing stuff in it, don't you think? To follow Jesus, you have to hate your parents, your husband or your wife, your kids, your siblings, and even your own life. On top of that, you have to be open to being nailed to a cross and die just like Jesus. But it's the hating of all those close family members that's so hard for me. Now, there was a time, I think, when I was young and maybe my parents wouldn't let me do something that I wanted to do, or maybe my sister or one of my brothers got me into some kind of trouble. I was always in trouble anyway. And after that happened, I'd say something like, I hate my dad, or I hate my brother. But that was an expression that we'd use when circumstances weren't entirely favorable for us. I think kids are still using it, maybe. But the truth is that for all my whining and complaining about hating someone, when it got right down to it, I could never really hate anyone, much less my immediate family. And while I could get mad at each family member from time to time, at my deepest level, I instinctively loved each of them, and I could not choose to hate them even if I wanted to. And I dare say that's probably true for all of us. But that's what makes these statements of Jesus so harsh to our ears, especially from the same Jesus who is quite well known for telling us to love even our enemies. I was talking to a friend about what her thoughts were on today's gospel, and her response was that if today's statements were all that we had available on what Jesus had to say, well, first of all, is not good news. And second, she'd be surprised at anyone following Jesus. So what's going on here with this gospel reading? And let me tell you, there really is some good news in it, maybe far more than we can realize with only a quick listen. But I'll start by saying that Jesus is quite well known for what's called hyperbole. And that's sort of an exaggerated way of speaking. Jesus would use it frequently, and he'd say something in a shocking way in order to make a point. Now, shock value is used as an aid or a tool to help us remember what he said, and in the process, make it available to our memory to recall and repeat it to others. Maybe you remember these statements of Jesus. If your right eye offends you, pluck it out. Or if your left hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. Now, both of these sayings are a similar kind of shocking way to make a point. And the point is, for those two sayings, that we need to rid ourselves of the things that cause us to sin. And in a sense, this is what Jesus is doing when he tells us that in order to follow him and to love him properly, we must place him in first place, and everyone and everything follows after him. When he tells us that we must love him and hate all else, he's saying we should not prefer anything more than him. Now, 2 or 3 weeks ago, we talked about Jesus telling us about loving God first. Anybody remember that? Maybe not. Well, all good things come from God. And so all the good things that we have, whether it's family or friends or possessions or wealth, or even our own lives, all of that ultimately comes from God. All of it. So all that we have, ultimately speaking, is God's gift to us, including our own lives. And remember, we talked about the fact that it's wrong or misdirected to love the gift more than the giver. Well, today, Jesus is saying that we can't love anyone more than we are supposed to love him. So the question is this: Why does Jesus have the right to demand that we love him more than your mom and dad, your husband or your wife, or your daughters and your sons? And just who can make that demand? Well, the crowds that Jesus was addressing that day would have caught on right away. And the language that he was using would have been crystal clear to them, all of them, because only God himself can demand that we love him with all our heart and with all our soul, and with all our mind and with all our strength. That comes from the Old Testament, the book of Deuteronomy. And Jesus's audience would have known that and had memorized it from very young ages. Jesus is here telling us who and what he is, that he's a divine person, that he isn't just the Messiah or just the King of Israel or a new prophet or a new Moses. He's none other than the one true God of Israel. And because he's divine, he can make divine demands. And so he wants to be number one in our hearts and in our minds. Now, he's actually quite clear and deliberate in what he says. Following him is not a casual thing, and being his disciple cannot be a wishy-washy affair. He's telling us that we have to be all in with him, or we're not in at all. The price of being his disciple is high, and there are several conditions that he tells us about. The first is this: everything and everyone we know and love in this life must take a second place to Jesus. Number two, we have to take up our cross and follow him. And by the way, the people he was talking to could not fully comprehend what he was saying about this, because Jesus was telling them what was going to happen in the future. And until it happened, they could not imagine that a man who is also divine would submit to that kind of torture and death. Anyway, number two is we have to take up our cross. And number three, we have to be prepared to live out a sort of detachment from any riches that we acquire, which means being able to let them go, as in almsgiving. In any event, we aren't supposed to be dependent on things anymore. And again, Jesus does not mince words here. The cost of following him is not an easy one to make. And his speech here is designed to make that perfectly clear. He wants us to take this very seriously, and even goes so far as telling us that we need to fully consider it before making the decision to follow him. We have a choice to make. And because it's such a radical thing that he's asking of us, he tells us what we have to expect. And what it all boils down to is this: we may worship only God, and nothing in or of this world should replace God. And we'll hear elsewhere in the Gospels that when we make God the only object of our worship, we are able to more properly attend to our other loves and interests. So this week, choose God. Choose to put Jesus before all else. Surrender your heart and your mind and your will to him, and tell him that's what you want to do, and ask for his help. He won't let you down, and in fact, will pick you up when you stumble. And in choosing Jesus, you will build an everlasting inheritance in heaven.